Hello, I'm here to talk about The Modern Senate, 1925 to 1963, by F.A. Kunz. This book was published in 1967. I borrowed a copy from my university library. I spent about 2 weeks reading it in preparation for an honors political science thesis I'm going to be writing this year. Kunz looks at the structure of the Senate, how it functions, how it has changed over the years, and how different methods of reform have been proposed or in some cases implemented. This book was published in the 60s, and for Kunz, he seems to believe that there's a long history of talk of reform, of Senate reform, and interestingly, in present day, Senate reform is still on the table. If not more than it was in the 1960s, it's actually an election issue. The federal NDP party wants to abolish the Senate. The Liberals and the Conservatives wish to reform the Senate. Kunz tackles a lot of criticisms of the Senate that he believes are unfair, and many of these criticisms are still directed towards the Senate today, such as the fact that the Senate doesn't sit very often, or that a lot of senators don't show up for the official sittings in the House. But, as Kunz explains, the Senate operates primarily through committees. Kunz sees the Senate as a very favorable and useful body. He sees it as an auxiliary check upon the executive, as a defender of provincial rights, as a constitutional tranquilizer, and as a defender of interest groups. Now, although I find his perception of the Senate overly optimistic, I do believe that he raises some good points. A few months ago in Canadian politics, our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, caused a bit of a stir when he said that he would no longer appoint any senators. Now, doing so, he can technically do it unless the Supreme Court orders him to appoint senators. Not appointing senators violates the Constitution, I believe, but Harper has said that he won't appoint any more senators so that he can force Senate reform. In order to reform the Senate, we would have to follow the 750 rule, which means that 7 out of the 10 provinces, which equal 50% of the population at least, would have to agree in order to implement a constitutional amendment. And it would seem that Harper wishes to encourage or force the provinces by letting the number of senators slowly dwindle. He wants to force them to consider and to negotiate on Senate reform. Interestingly, when I was reading this book, Harper's approach is nothing new. In 1955, the Senate had 21 vacancies. The Prime Minister at the time, Prime Minister Laurent, he chose not to appoint any more senators because he believed the body was undemocratic and needed to be reformed. And so he thought that by not appointing senators, he could force the issue of Senate reform. Kunz writes, Mr. St. Laurent was a man of justice and of common sense enough to see the inherent unfairness of the continuation of the practice of appointment. So, in essence, Harper borrowed a card from a previous Prime Minister, and this has been done before. This was done 60 years ago, and it didn't work, and I'm not sure if it'll work this time. On a lesser note, as I was reading this, I was surprised to discover that in order to get a divorce in Canada, you used to have to get a bill passed by Parliament, by both houses. Your bill would have to go either through the Senate and then through the House of Commons, or through the House of Commons and then through the Senate. Yes, so it did take me a little while to get through this book. That's why I haven't had a video up in almost 2 weeks. At the moment, I'm reading a 900-page book, 2666 by Roberto Bolaño, and I'm about 350 pages in, so it could be a little while before I have another video up, but thanks for watching.